Albert Heidman, better known under the sobriquet of Shiner Bob, was a well-known character around Spitalfields in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Derby Daily Telegraph described him as the terror of Spitalfields. The keepers, deputy keepers, and residents at the common lodging houses of the district were terrified of him. Indeed, according to one newspaper, there was not a man in Spitalfields who wasn't. Even the police were afraid of him, which, given the fact that he was frequently arrested for violent assault and felony, meant that they were forever trying to overcome their fear in order to take him into custody. According to the Express newspaper, Shiner Bob was quite simply the worst man in London. But how did Albert Heidman come by such a dramatic epithet? Well, to be honest, it is difficult to ascertain why he should have been viewed as any worse than all the other villains, ne'er-do-wells and street thugs that plagued the East End in the latter years of the Victorian era and on into the Edwardian age. In fact, combing through the newspaper accounts of the police court proceedings from the period, Heidman is almost conspicuous by his absence, and there were several other persistent offenders whose prolific law-breaking and antisocial antics could have seen them designated the worst man or woman in London, way ahead of Albert Heidman. One of the earliest newspaper mentions of him was in December 1899, when, then aged 29, he was charged at Worship Street Police Court with feloniously wounding George Squibb. However, at that same court, George Squibb was also charged with feloniously wounding Albert Heidman, so it would appear that the two were as bad as each other, albeit Heidman seems to have come off the worse from their encounter, as he did not actually appear in court since he was in the infirmary recovering from the injuries he had sustained during their altercation. Recalling the case in an interview that he gave to the Express in January 1904, Heidman explained, "On December the 23rd, 1899, I got into a bit of a row in Dorset Street. I had a fight with a man. He stabbed me in the shoulder blade, and I lost the use of my right arm. With that, I cut the man open with a glass. I spent 4 months at the infirmary. We were both discharged because we refused to prosecute each other." On this occasion, it was Squibb who appeared in court with his head in bandages, whose reputation the police chose to single out, with an officer telling the magistrate that he, Squibb, was a well-known violent character. Heidman next turned up in the newspapers in January 1904, and it would appear to be this case that sealed his reputation as the worst man in London. The Northampton Chronicle and Echo on Thursday the 21st of January reported that Flower and Dean Street, Spitalfields, has a most unenviable reputation and is prolific in cases for the neighbouring police court, Worship Street. A charge of manslaughter of an unusual character originating in that delectable thoroughfare was brought before Mr. Cluer on Wednesday. The prisoner was Albert Heidman, otherwise known as Shiner Bob, who was accused of shaking a man named James Jones to death in a common lodging house on Saturday night. Inspector Duval said that the prisoner was alleged to have pushed Jones away from the fire and to have given him so severe a shaking that he died from its effects. Further action could not be taken against Heidman until the inquest into James Jones's death had established an exact cause of death, and so Heidman, who was stated to have been many times charged with violent assault and felony, was remanded to await the outcome of the inquest. Win Edwin Baxter, the district's coroner, presided over the inquest on Thursday the 21st of January, and the Dundee Evening Telegraph published a summary of the proceedings in its next day's edition, under the headline, "Shiner Bob and His Lady." The article read, "The inquest on the body of James Jones, 45, a hawker living in Flower and Dean Street, Spitalfields, was held yesterday. Albert Heidman, otherwise known as Shiner Bob, has been charged with manslaughter in connection with the death and was present in the custody of warders. Before Jones died, he told his wife that Shiner Bob had given him the finishing stroke. Other witnesses described an incident at the lodging house where Shiner Bob seized the deceased by the shoulder, shook him violently, and struck him. Mrs. Jones cried out, 'Don't hit him, he's very bad.' He had been ill, and Shiner Bob apologised. One witness said that Shiner Bob's wife threw her weight about awful. Mrs. Bob waltzed in and hit the man on the head with a saucepan, and her husband was going to throw a pail of hot water over someone. Mary Ann Neville, the manageress of the lodging house, said it was difficult to deal with Shiner Bob and his wife. They made her life a misery. When Shiner Bob was in jail, his wife had another husband, just as bad as he was. They walked into her place with impunity, and her deputy dared not turn them out. Even the police were afraid of Bob. There was not a man in Spitalfields who was not. At this point, Heidman interrupted the proceedings, shouting out, "What? Afraid of a one-armed man?" The coroner responded, "I think your character is pretty well known to the police. I hear that you frequently visit His Majesty's homes." Dr. David Hume deposed to having made a post-mortem examination. Death was due to phthisis. The coroner asked, "Do you think what took place on Saturday night accelerated the death?" "I do not," replied the doctor. A verdict of death from natural causes was therefore recorded. The jury's verdict meant that there was no case for Heidman to answer, and at his next court appearance, the magistrate dismissed him. However, the comments about his reputation had been extensively reported in the press and had helped establish him as a local character. The Express newspaper was therefore quick to send a reporter to Spitalfields to track him down and secure an interview with him. Fittingly, the reporter caught up with Heidman in Dorset Street, which at the time was basking under the sobriquet of the worst street in London. The subsequent article was syndicated and appeared in newspapers all over the world, the following version being taken from the Derry Journal of Friday the 29th of January 1904. Shiner Bob, the worst man in London, tells his life story. The worst man in London was interviewed by an Express representative lately. The interview took place in a tavern in the worst street in London, Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Shiner Bob, or Albert Heidman, is the man who was recently charged at Worship Street Police Court with the manslaughter of James Jones by shaking him. But James Jones died of consumption, and Heidman was discharged. He has been many times in the police courts and has spent much time in jail. He is spoken of as a terror to the police, but he himself says that he is not so bad as he is painted, which is probably true. To look at, he is by no means the typical ruffian of the imagination, nor has he the build of a man who would kill a man by shaking him. He is thin as a lath, slippery rather than lithe, sunken in the chest but fairly tall. His right arm is paralysed, the result of a stab, and he carries his shrunken right hand in his jacket pocket. His face is thin, flushed and scarred, but not especially repulsive. Cheekbones somewhat high, chin somewhat square, eyes fairly clear. He might have been a good-looking youngster. His moustache is thin and the colour of straw. His white teeth are now broken and irregular. "I was born in Spitalfields," he said, "and I shall be 33 in February." He would not speak of his father and mother, except to say that they were both Jews and dead. "I went to the infant school in Wentworth Street off Petticoat Lane, then to the Jews' Free School, then to the Castle Street Board School, Whitechapel, which I left at the age of 12, having passed the 6th standard. I was then apprenticed as a boot riveter in Whitechapel, and worked at my trade till I was nearly 20. I was a good workman. Then I fell out of work for a while and got mixed up with bad company. The first time I was in custody was in January 1890, and I got 6 months. When I came out, I worked at my trade again until July 1892. One day 12 men interfered with me in Ernest Street, White Horse Lane, Stepney, which is worse than Dorset Street. I stabbed 3 of them and got 18 months at the Old Bailey. When I came out, I worked again until the week before Easter, 1894. I went to the bad then. I was 23 years old, and I have never worked since. I got 7 days for gambling in 1894, 3 months for loitering in the city in 1895. I was fined 10 shillings, or 7 days, for gambling in 1896. I paid the sum. In 1896 also, I was convicted innocently and suffered 12 months imprisonment for stealing a purse out of an handbag. I came out in December 1897. What were you doing between? Interrupted the interviewer. I was out thieving. I think it was August 1899 that I got 3 months for stealing a pocketbook out of a man's pocket, Limehouse way. I got my discharge on November the 3rd. You see, I went in as a Jew and came out at 4 o'clock on Friday night, a day earlier. They never keep a Jew over Saturday. Heidman, at this point in the interview, described the aforementioned 1899 exchange with George Squibb before continuing, in February 1901 I was fined 5 shillings or 5 days for being drunk. In the following July I had a few words with a man and he pulled out a revolver and a knife. With that I told him to wait a minute, and when I came back I had a chopper in my possession. I bought a 2-penny cigar and stood smoking it at the corner of White's Row, Spitalfields. He came over to me, pulled out a knife and made aim at me. I pulled out the chopper and struck him across the scalp. He was in hospital for 2 or 3 weeks. I got 20 months at North London Sessions. In October 1903, I was talking to a young woman one night when a policeman accused us of attempting to pick pockets. I got 3 months. Were you picking pockets? Asked the interviewer. Nah, but I knew they could give me 12 months for pocket picking, so to get off lightly, I said I had done it. The day I came out, I was shot at in a public house in Brick Lane, the Three Compasses, better known as the German House. The man had no heart or intention to shoot me. I was charged with being drunk and got fined 10 shillings or 7 days. I did the days. 6 days after I was out, I went to a lodging house to get warm, and the incident happened for which I was charged the other day. The lodging house keeper said that me and my missus were a terror to the neighbourhood. I'm telling you the truth, governor. With that, he went to the door and called to a crowd of children who were playing in the street outside. "Who am I?" he asked. "Shiner Bob," they shouted. "How do you live, Bob?" his interviewer asked. "Stealing," he said. And with that, the interview with Shiner Bob concluded, and Albert Heidman's moment in the spotlight drew to a close. There can be little doubt that Heidman was not the sort of character you would wish to meet on a dark night, nor for that matter on a bright summer's morning in Whitechapel or Spitalfields. But whether he deserved his reputation as the worst man in London, well, I'll leave it for you to decide. Personally, I can't help thinking that there were many more Spitalfields characters whose behaviour was equal to, if not worse than that of Shiner Bob. It just seems to have been that he was a better self-publicist than the other worst men in London. Or perhaps they simply thought that if they were going to earn a living by stealing and other nefarious means, then boasting about it to a national newspaper was probably not the wisest course of action.